It's strange how certain memories don't fade, even when decades pass. You can go on with your life, jobs, families, endless routines, but then something small triggers it. A smell, a sound, and suddenly, you're back in that room, that night, feeling the same cold breath on your neck. I thought I'd buried these stories long ago, but they've started bleeding back into my dreams. Maybe telling them is the only way to quiet them again. It began with the smallest thing, objects moving on their own. The sense that someone was awake when everyone else was asleep. Sometimes I'd wake in the middle of the night convinced someone was standing just beyond the edge of my bed watching me breathe. Other times, I'd hear soft whispering from behind a closed door, a voice that stopped the instant I tried to listen closer. For years, I told myself it was childhood imagination, the overactive kind that twists shadows into faces and floor creaks into footsteps. But now, I'm not sure. There's a weight behind those memories I can't shake anymore, like a door that's been sealed shut too long and is finally starting to crack open. It's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it, that pulse in the air when something unseen is near. It's like the room holds its breath. The sound of a clock stretches, every tick too loud, too slow. You tell yourself it's nothing, that you're safe, yet your skin disagrees. You feel it tightening, waiting, and when you finally dare to move, you half expect a hand to grab your wrist. That's how it always started for me. Not with screams or flickering lights, just small, wrong moments that built into something larger. I used to think each story was separate, strange coincidences from different years of my life. But now, the older I get, the more I wonder if they were pieces of the same thing, something that's been following me since childhood, slipping into the quiet places when no one's around. There was a boarding school, the smell of disinfectant and old wood, a farm, buried under endless summer nights that felt too long, and a window across from my childhood home, where a girl in a yellow sweater always stood waiting. Each memory is clear on its own, but together, they make a pattern that chills me. The more I think about them, the more the edges blur, as if they weren't just memories, but warnings. Even now, I still hear it sometimes, the sound that woke me first all those years ago. A light tap, like fingernails on glass, slow and deliberate. It stops whenever I turn my head, and I can feel it waiting for me to stop listening, to relax, before starting again. Maybe that's why I need to say this out loud. Maybe once it's told, it'll finally leave me alone. But deep down, I already know it won't. Because what's coming isn't a memory. It's a reminder, and it's getting closer. I was 12 when my parents sent me to a boarding school tucked deep in the countryside. They said it would build character, though it felt more like exile. The buildings were ancient gray stone, narrow halls, that permanent chill of places that never quite see sunlight. I was assigned to a 2-person dorm at the end of the corridor, next to the stairwell nobody used. My roommate was Weston. He was small, quiet, and pale in a way that made him look like he'd grown up underground. The first thing I noticed wasn't him, though it was the list taped to his desk. 10 items, all handwritten in neat block letters. Do not let light in after midnight. Do not talk to anyone who knocks after curfew. Do not touch the mirror if it fogs on its own. And at number 7, underlined twice, do not keep salt in the room. I remember laughing, thinking it was a joke, some private superstition. Weston didn't laugh back. He just looked at me and said, "They can smell it." He barely spoke to anyone during the day, but at night, I could hear him whispering. It wasn't English, not exactly. The sounds had a rhythm, like a song missing its melody. Sometimes I'd wake to see him sitting upright in bed, eyes open, lips moving silently. Other nights he'd scratch something into his notebook names, maybe. I once caught a glimpse. Long columns of letters, most crossed out in heavy black ink. When I asked about it, he just muttered, "They already came for those ones." I stopped asking. Weeks passed, in a fog of routine classes, meals, lights out at 10. But there was something wrong about our room. The air felt heavy, damp, even when windows were open. Every morning, I'd wake to find my sheets dusted with something like black sand. The janitor said it was from the old chimney, though our fireplace hadn't been used in years. One night, I woke to the sound of glass tapping. Not gentle, sharp, deliberate. The window by Weston's bed was vibrating slightly, like someone's fingertip pressed rhythmically against it from the outside. Weston was still asleep, face turned toward the wall. I wanted to wake him, but the words wouldn't come out. The tapping stopped. The silence after was worse. I turned on the bedside lamp, only to find the bulb flicker, then die. The darkness that followed wasn't just absence of light, it felt thick. That's when I saw movement near the window. Something pressed against the glass from the outside. A shape distorted by the reflection, but too large to be human. It had edges, like claws dragging softly along the pane. I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might wake Weston. Then, the sound came. A slow, deep inhale, as though something was sniffing the air from outside. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The claws left faint white lines on the window, tracing downward. When I blinked, the thing was gone. I stayed awake until dawn, shaking. Weston didn't move once. When morning light finally spilled through, the scratches were still there, thin and pale across the glass, like frost patterns. That day, Weston avoided me completely. During lunch, he stared into his soup for so long that even the teacher noticed. When I finally cornered him in our room that evening, he whispered, "You looked at it, didn't you?" I didn't answer. He closed his notebook and said, "Then it knows you now too." That night, I didn't sleep. The room felt colder than before, the shadows thicker. Around 2 a.m, I heard something soft and wet drip onto the floor. I turned and saw it just a drop, dark red, landing near my shoes. My first thought was a nosebleed, until I realized it was coming from the ceiling, the same corner where the old vent sat. I grabbed the lamp, but when the light hit, there was nothing there. Just dust. The drop was gone. By the next morning, Weston was gone too. His bed perfectly made, his list still taped to the desk. The headmaster said his parents had withdrawn him suddenly and packed his things overnight. Nobody saw them come. Nobody saw them leave. I remember staring at that list, reading the rules again. The one about salt bothered me most. That evening, I snuck some from the cafeteria and poured it in a small ring around my bed. I felt stupid doing it, but when lights went out, the room stayed quiet for the first time in weeks. I slept, finally, until a sound woke me. A scrape, metal against stone. The lamp flicked once and died. In the faint moonlight, I saw the salt ring near the window broken. A single smear cut through it, leading toward the desk. Weston's notebook was open, though I knew I'd closed it. I forced myself up and looked. My name had been added to the list. The ink still glistened. Beside it, faint but there, was another mark, a tiny symbol like a claw print pressed into the paper. I slammed the notebook shut and ran out of the room, barefoot, sprinting down the hall until I reached the staircase. I didn't stop until a teacher found me curled up by the radiator, sobbing. They said I'd had a night terror. Said Weston's disappearance had unsettled me. Maybe they were right. But a week later, during morning assembly, I caught sight of the janitor replacing the broken window in our room. When the light hit it just right, I could still see the scratches outside. 5 long marks, uneven, almost deliberate, like something had written from the other side. Years later, long after the school closed down, I went back once, out of something like guilt or curiosity. The dorm wing was sealed off, the floors thick with dust. I found our room. The desk was still there, and the tape residue where Weston's list had been. On a whim, I checked the wall behind it, and that's when I saw it etched deep into the wood. "Do not let light in after midnight," and below, faintly carved, my own name. For a moment, I felt 12 again, standing in that freezing room, waiting for something to happen. The window was cracked open, though no one had touched it in years. The air smelled faintly of iron. I told myself it was just the building decaying, the rot of time. But when I turned to leave, I swear I heard it again. That slow, patient tapping on glass, like it had been waiting all this time. The farm belonged to my grandparents, a place that always smelled of hay, smoke, and rain-soaked wood. Every summer, my parents sent me there to keep me away from the city noise, as if silence was a kind of safety. But silence in that house wasn't peaceful, it was watchful. The farmhouse sat alone, surrounded by endless wheat fields that rippled like the surface of an ocean when the wind passed. Inside, it was always dim, no matter how many lamps you turned on. My grandfather used to say it was because the house was tired. I didn't understand what that meant then. I do now. My room was at the top of the stairs, next to the attic door that never stayed shut. Every night before bed, my grandmother would check the latch, tug twice, and mutter a prayer under her breath. I'd ask her why, and she'd just say, "Old houses breathe. You have to remind them who's inside." That summer, I started hearing footsteps above me slow, dragging ones that paused right over my bed. When I told Grandpa, he laughed it off, said the boards up there expanded with the heat, but the sound wasn't wood. It had rhythm, weight. Some nights I'd even hear something like a hand brushing the attic door, testing the knob, as if deciding whether to come down. The first time I truly felt it wasn't my imagination was the night the lantern went out. I'd been reading by its light, fighting sleep, when it flickered and died. The dark was instant, thick as tar. I sat up and saw, faintly, the outline of the door to the attic. It was open just an inch, a thin black line cutting through the room. I froze, holding my breath. I could hear it, the soft sound of breathing that wasn't mine. Shallow, careful. I whispered for my grandfather, but the word barely left my throat. The door creaked wider. Something heavy shifted above the rafters, slow and deliberate. Then, the sound of fabric dragging across wood, like someone crawling. I remember sliding under the blanket, squeezing my eyes shut, the air inside hot and stale. It stayed like that for what felt like hours, until morning light seeped through the curtains and everything was still again. At breakfast, I told them. My grandmother went pale. My grandfather said nothing, just stood up, went to the attic, and stayed there a long time. When he came down, he told me not to worry, that he'd fixed it. But that night, I saw the same thing again. The door cracked open, a sliver of darkness that looked thicker than the rest of the room. I tried to be brave, to get up and close it myself. But as I stood, I heard a whisper right behind me, too close to be imagination. It said my name, soft, stretched, almost curious. I bolted to my grandparents' room, crying. My grandmother was already awake, sitting upright, staring at the window. She said nothing, just motioned for me to get in bed beside her. I fell asleep clutching her arm, but she never closed her eyes. The next morning, she burned sage and salt by the stairs, muttering prayers in Spanish. I watched as she traced small crosses with her finger against the doorframe. Grandpa told me to go outside, that the grown-ups had old matters to deal with. From the yard, I could hear thumping above, as if furniture was being dragged across the attic floor. Then, silence. The rest of that week was quiet. The door stayed closed, but the silence felt wrong, hollow, like the air was waiting for something to happen. It wasn't until years later, after both of them had passed, that I understood what had been waiting. At my grandmother's funeral, most of the family was too busy with guests and condolences. I found myself sitting in a side room with my cousin Francisco, who had also spent summers at the farm. He was older, quiet like Grandpa, and when I mentioned the attic, he didn't smile. He said, "You heard it too, didn't you?" I nodded, relieved someone else remembered. He leaned forward, his eyes glassy. "I saw it," he whispered. He told me about one night, maybe a year after my last visit, when he woke to the sound of footsteps in his room. He thought it was Grandpa checking the windows, until the mattress sank beside him. He said the dip was deep, like a grown person sitting down. He tried to speak, but his throat locked. Then, cold fingers brushed his hair back. He said it wasn't a dream, because he felt the weight, the smell, wet earth, and rust. When he finally turned his head, There was no one there. But the shape on the bed, that hollow where something had sat, didn't fade for minutes. It stayed pressed into the sheets, as if the weight refused to leave. After the funeral, Francisco and I went back to the farmhouse with my uncle to help sort through old belongings. The attic door was still there, same latch, same dust. I couldn't resist. I opened it. The smell hit first stale, damp, mixed with something metallic. The space was cramped, filled with boxes and old furniture covered in sheets. At the far end, near the window, I saw a small wooden rocking chair. It was moving, ever so slightly, even though the air was still. I told myself it was wind from the cracks, but the window was boarded. I reached out to touch it. The wood was cold. On the wall behind it, scratched deep into the plaster, was a pattern, a circle with what looked like 3 claw marks cutting through it. Beneath, faint writing. Only 2 words were still legible. Stay below. I stepped back, my stomach tightening. Francisco was behind me, pale. He pointed toward the floorboards under the chair. One plank was darker, newer than the rest. We both knew without saying it, Grandpa's fix. We didn't touch it. When we left the attic, my uncle said he'd sell the place. Too many bad memories. But the night before we drove out, I couldn't sleep. The air felt thick again. I heard it, the sound from years ago. That dragging, slow movement above us. Then, the rocking chair. Faintly, its creak carried through the ceiling, back and forth, steady as breathing. Francisco heard it too. I saw his eyes open in the dark. We didn't move. We didn't say a word. At dawn, it stopped. I've never gone back since. They tore the farmhouse down 5 years later after a storm collapsed the roof. But sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I hear it again. The sound of something heavy shifting just above me, boards straining. That same slow breath. And when it happens, I always look up at the ceiling and think of that one message carved into the wall, the one that never made sense until now. Stay below. Maybe they weren't warning me to stay away from the attic. Maybe they were warning it, because sometimes, when the air is still enough, I swear I can feel it waiting to come down. When I was 9, our house sat directly across from another 2-story home, with yellow curtains and a balcony that faced my bedroom. It was the kind of quiet neighborhood where nothing ever happened, just trimmed lawns, barking dogs, and the hum of sprinklers at sunset. My parents were always working late, so evenings were mostly mine. I'd sit by the window, draw, or watch the street lamps flicker on one by one. That's when I first saw her. A girl about my age, standing at her own window across the street, wearing a mustard yellow sweater. She never opened the glass, never spoke, just stood there, hands resting on the sill, watching. When she noticed me looking, she smiled. I smiled back. That became our routine. Every night, around the same time, she'd appear. Sometimes she'd wave. Sometimes she'd hold up a piece of paper with a doodle, a cat, a sun, once a heart. I'd draw something too and press it against my window. It felt like we were friends, even though we'd never exchanged a word. I told my mom about her once during dinner. She looked up, confused, said the house across the street had been empty since last spring. I laughed, thinking she was teasing me. The next night, the girl was there again. Same yellow sweater, same calm smile. So I told her through gestures, pointing, mouthing words slowly, asking if she wanted to play outside sometime. She shook her head, then wrote something on her paper. Can't leave. I remember frowning, writing back, why? But she just looked away, then disappeared from the window. That night was the first time I heard the tapping. Soft at first, like a branch brushing glass, but steady, deliberate. I checked my window. Nothing. When I looked back toward hers, she was standing there again, except now the light behind her was dimmer, flickering. She lifted her hand and tapped her own window 3 times. Tap, 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 then pointed at me. I didn't move. She mouthed something slowly, her lips trembling a little. It looked like please. Then the light in her room went out. I told my dad the next morning. He said I was dreaming. He even took me outside to show me curtains drawn, no sign of life. He said maybe someone was fixing the place and I should stop staring into people's homes. So I tried. But that night, curiosity won. I stayed up, lights off, waiting. Around 9, she appeared again. Faint in the dim glow of the streetlight, her face looked different, paler, like the color had drained away. The glass was fogged from the inside, and her hand kept tracing slow shapes on it. Circles, lines. I thought she was drawing until I realized she was writing. I squinted, but it was backwards. So I wrote the letters down on paper as she made them. H-E-L-P. My heart started pounding. I waved, trying to signal her to open the window, but she only pressed her palms against the glass. Then her breath made a small patch of fog, and for a second, I saw something reflected behind her, a shape taller than her, standing in the dark corner of the room. I ran to get my parents. By the time they followed me back, the window was empty again. My father looked frustrated, my mother uneasy. She told him to close the blinds, said it wasn't good for me to look out there so much. The next morning, when I tried to peek through, the curtains were tied shut, but even then, I could feel that someone was still on the other side, waiting. Weeks passed. The girl didn't return. I started to think maybe I'd imagined her, but one night, during a storm, I woke to a sound, faint, rhythmic, like someone gently knocking. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't from my door. It was coming from the window again. I pulled the curtain aside just an inch. Lightning flashed, and there she was right outside the glass, her face pale and wet, hair plastered to her forehead, eyes wide and unfocused. I froze. My room was on the second floor. Before I could scream, thunder cracked and the light was gone. When it flashed again, she wasn't there. Only streaks of water running down the pane. The next morning, my parents found me curled in the corner, shaking. I told them she'd been there, right outside. My father said the wind had scared me, but my mother stayed silent, her face drained of color. That afternoon, I saw her talking to a man in a suit outside the realtor for the house across the street. Later that evening, she came to my room and said, "Don't look out the window anymore, sweetheart. Not even during the day." She sounded almost pleading. I promised, but curiosity is stronger than fear when you're 9. 2 nights later, I broke the rule. I lifted the curtain just a little. The house across the street was dark, completely dark, except for one faint glow coming from the upstairs window, the same one she'd stood in. The curtains were still drawn, but something was moving behind them. Slowly, like someone pacing. Then, the shape stopped. A hand pressed against the fabric, small, with fingers splayed wide. Lightning lit the sky again, and I saw it just for a second, the outline of that yellow sweater, damp and torn. I stumbled backward, tripping over my chair. The thunder that followed rattled the glass. The next morning, the house was surrounded by police tape. I remember hearing adults whispering near the mailboxes, saying the property had finally been sold, that a crew had gone in to inspect it. They'd found signs of squatters, old food wrappers, a mattress, but one of the officers had gotten sick, said the air inside was heavy and smelled like rot. I overheard someone mention a small faded stain near the window upstairs, like old water damage. No one talked about a child. A few years later, after we moved away, I came across an old newspaper clipping while unpacking boxes. The headline was small, buried deep in the pages. "Local girl dies in house fire." The photo showed the same yellow sweatered girl, hair tied in braids, smiling awkwardly at the camera. The date was from 3 years before we moved into that neighborhood. 3 years before I ever saw her at the window. The article said the fire started in her bedroom. They'd never determined the cause, only that she'd been found near the window, as if she'd been trying to get out. I stared at that photo for a long time, my chest tight, the same dread returning like it had never left. I showed my mom. She turned white, folded the clipping, and said quietly, "Some things aren't meant to be remembered." She threw it in the trash, but that night, I fished it back out. I still have it, tucked between the pages of a sketchbook I can't bring myself to open anymore. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wake to that faint sound in my dreams, the 3 soft taps against glass, slow and patient. Tap, 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 and in that half-awake haze, I can almost see her again, the girl in the yellow sweater, eyes wide, lips forming a word I can't quite hear. Sometimes I think she's asking for help. Sometimes I think she's just reminding me she's still there. But lately, when I walk past mirrors or dark windows at night, I swear I see her reflection over my shoulder, always waiting, always watching. There's a strange stillness that comes after stories like these, a silence that doesn't comfort but listens. Sometimes I wonder if telling them really keeps them away, or if it's what draws them back. Because when you say their names, when you remember the way the air felt in those moments, you invite them to listen too. I've spent years trying to convince myself that childhood fears dissolve with age, that logic fills the gaps where shadows once lived. But it isn't true. The things we see when we're young don't vanish, they just learn to hide better. Weston's empty bed, the hollow in that farmhouse attic, the faint tapping on glass, they still follow me, stitched into the quiet parts of my life. They appear in small, ordinary ways. The light flickering in an empty room, a cold draft from a closed window, the sense that someone has just left the space you've entered. You tell yourself you're imagining it. You always do. What unsettles me most is how these memories connect, how they all hum with the same low frequency of something unfinished. Each moment felt isolated when it happened. One boy disappearing, one presence above the ceiling, one girl trapped behind glass. But maybe they were never separate. Maybe they were echoes of the same thing that feeds on attention, slipping into cracks where people are too lonely or too curious. When you're a child, you open doors without thinking. When you grow older, you realize some doors never close again. Every so often, when I wake in the middle of the night, I feel it, the weight of the house pressing down, the hush before a sound you can't explain. And I remember Weston whispering rules in the dark, my grandmother murmuring prayers she didn't finish, the girl's hand against the fogged glass. They all said the same thing, in their own way. Don't look. Don't listen. Don't answer. Yet here I am, still talking about them, still keeping them alive with every word. Maybe that's the real curse, how stories like these never truly end. They just wait for someone else to hear them, to believe them, to look too long into the dark. And once you do, you start to notice it too. The way the air thickens before something unseen breathes close. The quiet pulse behind the walls. The faint echo of nails against glass. If you're listening now, and the room feels colder than it did before, don't turn around. Just sit still. Let the silence stretch. You'll know it when it's near, because it always starts the same way, soft, patient, impossible to mistake.